"Get the hell out of this lounge, now." The voice cut through the quiet of the VIP winter lounge like a blade sharper than the wind howling outside the frost-covered windows. Daniel Hayes stood motionless, snow still clinging to his work boots, melting slowly onto the polished marble floor. Nobody asked his name. Nobody checked his flight confirmation carefully. They saw the canvas work jacket, the worn leather gloves tucked into his pocket, the sawdust still visible on his jeans, and they decided he didn't belong here. Margaret Collins stood behind the reception desk with her arms crossed, her burgundy blazer immaculate, her expression carved from the same ice that coated the runway outside. The winter lounge lived up to its name not just because of the season, but because of the coldness radiating from every surface, every glance, every word spoken by its gatekeeper. "I have confirmation," Daniel said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. His fingers were still stiff from the cold outside, from the 3 hours he'd spent finishing a timber frame in sub-zero temperatures before racing to Aspen Ridge International Airport. Margaret didn't move to take the paper he extended toward her. She glanced at it from where she stood, her eyes barely registering the Northern Crest Aviation letterhead before dismissing it entirely. "This lounge is for premium passengers only," she said, her tone suggesting she'd already made up her mind about who qualified as premium and who didn't. "We have standards to maintain." The lounge stretched out behind her like a museum of wealth, leather chairs the color of aged whiskey, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the storm outside, a fireplace crackling with gas flames that would never spit ash or require actual wood. A handful of passengers occupied the space. A businessman in a cashmere overcoat typing on a laptop, an elderly couple sharing champagne, a woman in designer sunglasses despite the gray winter light. None of them looked at Daniel directly, but he felt their awareness of him like a physical pressure. "I have a flight departing at 7, Daniel said, keeping his voice level. "Northern Crest Aviation confirmed lounge access. It's on the reservation." "Northern Crest," Margaret repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "I'll need to verify that." She made no move toward her computer. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Let Daniel stand there in his work clothes while melted snow pooled around his boots. Outside, the storm was intensifying. The weather report that morning had called it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, 8 below zero, visibility near zero, most commercial flights already canceled. Daniel had driven through it anyway, his truck barely making it up the mountain road to the airport because the lawyers in Denver wouldn't wait. His mother's estate wouldn't settle itself. The trust fund she'd established for Lily, his 10-year-old daughter, currently staying with his sister in town, required signatures that couldn't be postponed. "Ma'am," Daniel tried again, "I can call the charter company if—" "You can leave," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising just enough to carry across the lounge. "Before I have security remove you. We've had issues with people trying to access premium facilities they haven't paid for. I won't have it. Not in my lounge." The businessman looked up from his laptop. The elderly couple paused mid-sip. The woman in sunglasses tilted her head, watching. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. It was the chill of being weighed, measured, and found wanting based on nothing but appearance. The chill of being invisible while standing right in front of someone. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," he said. Margaret's smile was ice. "I am the supervisor, and I'm asking you to leave. Now." Daniel Hayes hadn't planned to look like someone who didn't belong in a VIP lounge. He'd planned to finish the Riverside Community Center's timber frame, clean up, change clothes, and make the 2-hour drive to Aspen Ridge with time to spare. But then the snow had started earlier than forecast, and the structural engineer had called with last-minute changes, and Daniel had faced a choice. Finish the job right or arrive on time looking presentable. For Daniel, there was never really a choice. You did the work right. Every time. That's what his father had taught him during 16-hour days in their family workshop. Hands raw from planing oak and cherry and walnut into furniture that would outlive them both. That's what Daniel had passed on to the apprentices he trained, young men and women who came to him because they'd heard he was the best timber framer in 3 counties. The work was honest. The work mattered. The work was what remained after everything else fell apart. 3 years ago, when Natalie died, the work had saved him. Stroke at 34, the doctors had said, a statistical nightmare, a tragedy without warning or mercy. One moment she'd been laughing at breakfast, teasing him about the sawdust perpetually caught in his hair. The next, she was gone. Just gone. And Daniel was left with a 6-year-old daughter who kept asking when Mommy would wake up. He'd buried his wife on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, he'd gone back to the workshop because Lily needed routine and Daniel needed something his hands could fix. You couldn't fix death. You couldn't plane it smooth or joint it square or finish it with Danish oil until it gleamed, but you could build a shed for Mrs. Patterson who'd been widowed the year before. You could teach Marcus, the kid from the group home, how to read wood grain. You could be present for your daughter when she woke up crying at 2 a.m. because she'd forgotten, just for a second, that her mother wasn't coming back. The work didn't judge. The work didn't ask questions. The work simply was. 4 weeks ago, Daniel's mother had joined his father and his wife in the ground. Esophageal cancer, swift and brutal. She'd made it through Thanksgiving, squeezed Lily's hand during grace, whispered to Daniel that she was proud of the man he'd become. She died 3 days later. In her will, she'd left everything to Lily, the modest house she'd lived in for 40 years, her savings, and a trust fund Daniel hadn't known existed. Apparently, his father's furniture business had been more successful than anyone realized. Apparently, his parents had invested wisely, lived frugally, and saved everything for their granddaughter's future. The lawyers needed Daniel in Denver to sign paperwork. The trust required establishment by December 31st for tax purposes. It was December 28th. Commercial flights were booked solid for the holiday week, so Daniel had chartered a plane through Northern Crest, a company his mother's financial advisor had recommended, promising it would be simpler than driving through the mountains in winter. He'd left the work site at 3 p.m., still wearing his canvas Carhartt jacket because the heater in his truck was broken and he needed the insulation. He'd planned to change at the airport, had a duffel bag with clean clothes in his truck, but the parking lot was chaos and he'd barely made it inside before the storm grounded everything. Now he stood in the winter lounge with snow melting off his boots, listening to a woman tell him he didn't belong, and all he could think about was Lily. She'd drawn him a picture that morning before he left, stick figures of the two of them holding hands under a sunshine that looked like a yellow explosion. She'd written "Me and Dad" in letters that wandered across the page. She'd asked him if he was sad about Grandma. He'd told her the truth. Yes, but he was grateful too. Grateful that Grandma had made sure Lily would be okay no matter what. Now he needed to get to Denver to make that promise real. And Margaret Collins was telling him to get the hell out. Margaret reached for the phone at her desk with the deliberate motion of someone who'd made this call before, who knew exactly how these situations resolved. 2 rings, then a voice on the other end. "Security to the winter lounge, please," she said, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "We have an unauthorized individual who's refusing to leave." Daniel didn't move. He could leave. He could walk out, wait at a regular gate, call the charter company from there. But something in Margaret's certainty that he didn't belong, her absolute conviction that his appearance told her everything she needed to know about his worth, it hooked into something deep in his chest. How many times had Lily come home from school talking about kids who decided she was poor because her lunch came in a paper bag instead of an insulated container? How many times had he told her that people's value had nothing to do with what they wore or owned? He'd be damned if he'd teach her that lesson by running away the first time someone judged him. The elevator chimed. 2 security officers emerged, their uniforms crisp despite the chaos of the storm-affected airport. The older one, his nameplate reading Officer Blake Turner, approached with the wary confidence of someone used to dealing with conflicts. The younger officer, Officer Ethan Cruz, hung back slightly, observing. "Afternoon, ma'am," Blake said to Margaret, then turned to Daniel. "This man is attempting to access the Winter Lounge without proper authorization," Margaret said before Daniel could speak. "I've asked him to leave. He's refused." Blake looked at Daniel, really looked, his gaze taking in the work clothes, the snow still clinging to the steel-toed boots, the calluses visible on Daniel's hands. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "Do you have a boarding pass, sir?" Blake asked. Daniel handed over the confirmation from Northern Crest Aviation. Blake studied it, his eyebrows rising slightly. He showed it to Ethan, who leaned in to read. "This shows lounge access included," Ethan said quietly. "Anyone can print a fake confirmation," Margaret interjected, her voice sharp. "Look at him, Blake. Does he look like someone who flies private?" The question hung in the air like the snowflakes swirling outside the windows. Blake's jaw tightened. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Around the lounge, conversations had stopped. Phones had appeared. The businessman was recording now, his device angled to capture the scene. The woman in designer sunglasses had lowered them to watch directly. "Ma'am," Blake said carefully, "the confirmation appears legitimate. It has the right codes, the right format." "I don't care what it looks like," Margaret said. "I have a responsibility to maintain the integrity of this space. We've had incidents. People wandering in off the concourse, claiming they belong. This is a premium facility. We have standards." "Standards?" Daniel repeated quietly. It was the first word he'd spoken since the officers arrived. "Standards that include judging people by their clothes, standards that include verification," Margaret shot back, "which you've failed to provide adequately. Anyone can claim anything. I'm protecting our legitimate guests." She gestured toward the lounge as if presenting evidence: the businessman in cashmere, the elderly couple with their champagne, the designer sunglasses woman who probably spent more on her handbag than Daniel made in a month. "I can call Northern Crest," Daniel offered. "They can confirm. Or you can leave," Margaret interrupted, "before this becomes more complicated than it needs to be." "I'm trying to be reasonable here." Blake looked from Margaret to Daniel, clearly torn between the confirmation in his hand and the pressure radiating from the lounge supervisor. Protocol said the confirmation was valid, but protocol also said to defer to the facility supervisor in disputes about access. "Sir," Blake said finally, his tone apologetic but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me while we sort this out. We can make calls from the security office, verify everything properly. In other words," Daniel said, "guilty until proven innocent." Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written across his uncomfortable expression, across Margaret's satisfied smile, across the watching faces of passengers who'd already decided which side of this equation they were on. The businessman in the cashmere overcoat looked at Daniel for exactly 3 seconds before returning to his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with renewed focus, as if the conflict unfolding 10 feet away required intense concentration elsewhere. The recording he'd started stopped. His phone disappeared into his pocket. The elderly couple, distinguished, silver-haired, wearing the kind of understated elegance that came from decades of comfort, exchanged a glance. The woman's hand moved slightly, as if she might say something, but her husband touched her wrist gently, a small shake of his head. Their champagne sat forgotten, going flat while they studied the storm outside with sudden fascination. Near the fireplace, a younger woman in athletic wear looked up from her tablet, then quickly back down. Her thumbs moved across the screen, probably texting someone about the scene, turning it into content for distant consumption rather than a moment requiring actual presence or courage. Only the woman in designer sunglasses continued watching openly, her expression unreadable behind her Dior frames. She'd pushed them up now, her eyes meeting Daniel's briefly before sliding away to study Margaret with something that might have been recognition. This was the silence Daniel recognized. Not the quiet of peace or contemplation, but the deliberate absence of sound that came when people decided a problem wasn't theirs to solve, when someone else's dignity wasn't worth the risk of mild social discomfort. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the storm continued its assault on the airport. Snow fell so thick it blurred the runway lights into smeared orbs of yellow-white. The temperature display on the lounge's wall screen showed -8 degrees Celsius. Feels like -18 with wind chill. Somewhere out there, ground crews were working in conditions that would freeze exposed skin in minutes, making sure planes could still land and take off safely. But inside the winter lounge, with its gas fireplace and its complimentary champagne and its carefully controlled 72-degree comfort, nobody wanted to think about the cold. Daniel felt it anyway. The cold of being looked at and dismissed. The cold of watching people choose comfort over conviction. The cold that came from understanding that these people, these premium passengers, these individuals who'd earned or inherited or married into their lounge access, would go home tonight and never think about him again. Blake's hand hovered near Daniel's elbow, not quite touching but making the expectation clear. Time to go. Time to stop making everyone uncomfortable. Time to accept that the world had decided what a private jet passenger looked like, and Daniel Hayes in his work clothes didn't fit the template. Daniel thought about Lily's drawing, safely folded in his jacket pocket. Me and Dad. Two stick figures holding hands under an explosion of sunshine. She'd used every color in her pencil set for that sun, yellow and orange and even some red and pink, like she was trying to draw warmth itself onto the page. Before they'd left that morning, she'd asked him to bring her back something from Denver. Not a toy, she'd specified. Something real. Something that matters. He'd promised her he would. Promised her that this trip, this paperwork, this trust fund from the grandmother who'd loved her fiercely, it all mattered. It was all real. Now he stood in a lounge designed to make people feel important, being told he wasn't important enough to be there, while people who could have spoken chose silence instead. Daniel made a decision. No, he said quietly. Blake blinked. Sir? No, Daniel repeated, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made Ethan straighten unconsciously. I'm not going anywhere. I have valid lounge access. I have a flight to catch. I'm going to sit down and wait for my departure like every other passenger here. Margaret's face flushed. If you don't leave right now. You'll what? Daniel asked, and his voice wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being judged, tired of being invisible. Tired of watching his daughter face the same treatment and having to explain why the world was like this. Call more security? Make a scene? Prove to everyone here that you value appearance over reality? Daniel didn't raise his voice. He'd learned long ago that volume wasn't the same as power, that the quietest words could carry the most weight if you chose them carefully and meant them completely. My name is Daniel Hayes, he said, addressing not just Margaret and the security officers but the entire lounge. The businessman pretended not to listen, but his fingers had stilled on the keyboard. The elderly couple had stopped even pretending to look at the storm. Everyone was listening now, whether they wanted to admit it or not. I'm a timber framer. I work with my hands. I build things that last: community centers, homes, structures that'll be standing long after I'm gone. He held up his hands, showing the calluses, the healed cuts, the permanent stain of wood and weather. These hands raised my daughter alone after my wife died 3 years ago. Stroke. She was 34. Margaret opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My daughter's name is Lily. She's 10. This morning, before I left, she drew me a picture of the two of us. She used every color she had for the sun because she wanted it to be warm enough to reach Denver. Daniel's voice remained steady, but something in it made Ethan look away. She asked me to bring her back, something real from this trip. Something that matters. Blake shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable now, seeing Daniel differently than he had 60 seconds ago. My mother died 4 weeks ago. Cancer. She left everything she had to Lily, a trust fund to make sure my daughter would be okay, could go to college, could have opportunities. The lawyers need me in Denver to sign papers before the year ends. That's in 3 days. Daniel paused, letting that sink in. I chartered a plane through Northern Crest Aviation because commercial flights are booked and I can't risk missing this deadline. Not for Lily. The woman in designer sunglasses had removed them completely now, her expression soft with something that looked like recognition or regret. I came straight from a work site because the storm came early and I had to choose between finishing a job right or changing clothes. I chose the work. I always choose the work because the work doesn't lie. The work doesn't judge. The work is just. True. Daniel looked at Margaret directly. I didn't know that coming here in work clothes would make you see someone who doesn't belong. Someone you assume is lying. Someone you need to remove before he contaminates your premium space. I didn't, Margaret started. You did, Daniel said. Not unkindly, just factual. You looked at my boots and my jacket and you decided I was a problem to solve instead of a person to respect. You didn't ask questions. You didn't verify. You just judged. The lounge was absolutely silent now, except for the storm outside and the soft crackle of the gas fireplace. Even the background music seemed to have stopped, though that was probably Daniel's imagination. I'm not angry, Daniel continued, and realized with some surprise that it was true. I'm just tired of living in a world where my daughter has to learn that people will measure her worth by her shoes instead of her heart, where I have to explain to her why the kids at school assume she's poor because I pack her lunch in paper bags instead of buying the pre-made stuff in plastic containers. The businessman closed his laptop quietly. The elderly woman's hand moved to her husband's arm, squeezing. I'm going to sit down now, Daniel said. I'm going to wait for my flight. And when I get to Denver, I'm going to sign papers that will give my daughter security I never had. Then I'm going to come home and tell her what I brought back from this trip. He looked around the lounge, meeting eyes that quickly looked away or held steady depending on the courage behind them. What I learned here. About judging people. About choosing comfort over what's right. About being the kind of person who speaks up instead of staying silent. He walked to an empty chair by the window and sat down, his work boots leaving small puddles of melted snow on the pristine floor. Nobody stopped him. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt different from the silence before. It was heavier, charged with the collective discomfort of people forced to examine their own complicity. Margaret stood frozen behind her desk, her face cycling through expressions: indignation, uncertainty, something that might have been shame if she'd let herself feel it fully. Blake and Ethan exchanged glances. Blake's hand had dropped away from Daniel's elbow, his entire posture shifting from enforcement to uncertainty. The protocol was clear. Remove the problem. But the problem had just revealed itself to be a grieving father trying to secure his daughter's future, and that didn't fit neatly into the categories Blake was trained to manage. Ma'am, Blake said to Margaret, his voice low, the confirmation does appear legitimate. Maybe we should. The phone at the front desk rang, cutting him off. Margaret stared at it for 2 rings before answering. Her movements mechanical. Winter Lounge. This is Margaret Collins. Her professional voice was back, armor against whatever she was feeling. She listened, and Daniel watched her expression change. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like the ground dropping out from under her. Are you certain? She asked, her voice not quite steady. Yes, I understand. No, that won't be yes. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. That was the tower, she said, the words coming out slowly. There's a private aircraft on final approach. Gulfstream G 650. She swallowed visibly. Registered to Daniel Hayes. The lounge erupted in murmurs. The businessman spun in his chair to look at Daniel. The elderly couple leaned forward. The woman in designer sunglasses smiled, small and knowing. Blake and Ethan moved to the windows instinctively, drawn by the announcement like everyone else. Outside, the storm continued its white fury. But through the swirling snow, lights appeared. Red and white navigation lights. Then the brilliant landing lights, cutting through the darkness and snowfall like knives through fabric. The Gulfstream G650 emerged from the storm like a mythical creature materializing from clouds. Even in these conditions, even through the reduced visibility and the wind that had grounded lesser aircraft, it flew steady and sure. The pilots knew their work, trusted their instruments, brought $30 million worth of aircraft through conditions that would terrify most people. The wheels touched down on the snow-dusted runway with barely a puff of white, the kind of landing that came from thousands of hours of experience. The aircraft rolled out, its engines reversing with a sound that penetrated even the lounge's insulated walls. Then it was taxiing, following the ground crew's signals, heading directly toward the private terminal gates, heading toward the winter lounge. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Margaret's face had gone white. Her hand still rested on the phone, knuckles pale with pressure. Blake let out a long breath, the kind that came when you realized you'd nearly made a catastrophic mistake. Ethan looked from the approaching aircraft to Daniel, his young face showing the exact moment he understood what had almost happened here. The businessman had his phone out again, but this time he wasn't recording the conflict. He was frantically searching something, probably the registration number of the Gulfstream, probably trying to figure out who Daniel Hayes really was. Through the window, the aircraft turned onto the taxiway that led to the private gates. Its lights reflected off the snow and ice, creating halos of gold and white against the storm-dark afternoon. Beautiful, powerful, unmistakable, and registered to the man in the work boots whom they'd tried to throw out. The Gulfstream G650 moved across the tarmac with the grace of something that belonged in the air but temporarily consented to touch Earth. Even through the storm, even with snow accumulating on every surface, the aircraft commanded attention. Its distinctive profile, the swept wings, the elegant fuselage, the engines mounted high on the rear marked it as one of the fastest, longest-range business jets in the world. It cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, and it belonged to the man Margaret had told to get the hell out. The ground crew scrambled to position the mobile stairs, fighting the wind that wanted to turn everything into a projectile. Their orange vests stood out against the white landscape like signals, visible even through the reduced visibility. The stairs locked into place. The aircraft door opened, warm cabin air meeting freezing exterior in a visible wave of condensation, but nobody emerged. The plane sat there, engines still running on idle, as if waiting. Inside the winter lounge, absolute silence had descended again. This silence was different from all the others. It was the silence of people holding their breath, of collective realization dawning, of social equations being frantically recalculated. Blake had backed away from Daniel without even seeming to realize he was doing it, putting distance between himself and a situation that had transformed from routine ejection to potential disaster. His hand moved unconsciously to his radio, probably calculating how to report this to his supervisor, how to explain that he'd almost forcibly removed a man from the lounge he owned access to via a $30 million aircraft. Margaret hadn't moved. She stood behind her desk like a statue, still gripping the phone. Her earlier certainty replaced by the dawning horror of someone who judged a book by its cover and discovered it was a first edition. Ethan, the younger officer, had pulled out his phone not to record, but to search. His thumbs moved rapidly across the screen, his eyes widening as he read. Then he showed the screen to Blake, whose face went from pale to ashen. The businessman in cashmere had stopped pretending to work entirely. His laptop sat closed, forgotten. He stared at Daniel with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for museum pieces or accident scenes, trying to reconcile the man in work clothes with the aircraft visible through the window. The elderly couple whispered to each other, the woman's hand covering her mouth. Whether in shock or regret, Daniel couldn't tell. Only the woman in designer sunglasses looked unsurprised. She'd moved closer to the window, her reflection visible in the glass overlaying the scene outside. Her expression held something like vindication, as if she'd known all along that Margaret's judgment would backfire spectacularly. Outside, the Gulfstream's door remained open. The stairs were in place. The crew inside was clearly waiting for their passenger, waiting for Daniel. The storm continued around the aircraft, snow swirling in the downwash from the idling engines, creating patterns of white against the gathering dusk. The runway lights had come on fully now, strings of illumination marking safe paths through the winter darkness. Beyond the airport's perimeter, the mountains were invisible, swallowed by cloud and snowfall. Daniel remained seated in his chair by the window, looking out at the aircraft with an expression that gave nothing away. He'd known it was coming. He'd confirmed the flight that morning had received the message about early departure due to the storm. None of this was a surprise to him. But to everyone else in the winter lounge, it was a revelation, the kind that changed everything. The elevator chimed again, and Harold Whitmore emerged with the purposeful stride of someone who'd received an urgent call and understood that his next actions would determine whether this situation became a lawsuit, a viral incident, or both. The airport's assistant director of operations was in his late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that suggested he'd been in meetings with people important enough to require formal dress even during a storm. His eyes swept the lounge in one practiced motion, taking in the frozen tableau. Margaret behind her desk, the security officers looking like they wished the floor would open beneath them, Daniel sitting calmly by the window, and the gathered passengers watching with the rapt attention usually reserved for premium entertainment. "Mr. Hayes," Harold said, walking directly to Daniel, his hand extended. "Harold Whitmore, Assistant Director of Operations. I apologize for the confusion. Your aircraft is ready for boarding whenever you are." Daniel stood and shook the offered hand. "Thank you." Harold turned to Margaret, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees despite the gas fireplace. "Miss Collins, my office." "Now, sir, I can explain," Margaret began. "My office," Harold repeated, his voice pleasant but carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions. Then he turned back to Daniel, his expression shifting to something more genuine, more uncomfortable. "Mr. Hayes, I need to apologize personally. What happened here is unacceptable. You're not just a valued customer of this airport. You're a significant investor in Northern Crest Aviation and several infrastructure projects throughout Colorado. The way you were treated." "You know who he is?" the businessman blurted out, unable to contain himself. Every head in the lounge turned toward Harold, waiting for the answer that would complete the picture. Harold glanced at the businessman, clearly weighing how much to say, then decided the damage was already done, and transparency was the only path forward. "Mr. Hayes is a private investor with substantial holdings in commercial real estate, infrastructure development, and aviation." His mother's trust fund, Harold paused, recalibrating. "I shouldn't discuss his private affairs. What matters is that Mr. Hayes is exactly the kind of passenger this lounge exists to serve, and we failed him completely." The elderly woman made a small sound, quickly stifled. The businessman looked like he'd been struck. Even the woman in designer sunglasses raised her eyebrows, evidently not having known the full extent of what she'd been watching. "My mother," Daniel said quietly, speaking for the first time since sitting down, "believed in investing in communities. In places that needed infrastructure, in projects that would employ people like me, people who work with their hands, who build real things." He looked at Margaret, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "She taught me that wealth was a responsibility, not a trophy. That how you treated people mattered more than how much you had." Harold nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression, not just of who Daniel was, but of what this situation represented. This wasn't just about money or status. It was about exactly what Daniel had said before. Judgment based on appearance, dignity denied because of clothes. I inherited her investment portfolio 4 weeks ago, Daniel continued. I'm still learning what she owned, where she put her money, why she made the choices she made. I do know she believed in Northern Crest because they hired veterans and single parents as crew. She believed in this airport because it served mountain communities that needed connection to larger cities. He paused, his gaze moving to the window where his aircraft waited in the snow. She would have been appalled by what happened here today. Not because I was disrespected, she'd have told me that's just ego, but because it proves that we still live in a world where people assume someone in work clothes can't possibly belong in a premium space, where security gets called before questions get asked, where everyone watches and nobody speaks up. The lounge was silent again, but this time it was the silence of people genuinely listening, of discomfort that might possibly lead to actual reflection. Harold cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, I'd like to offer you— I don't want compensation, Daniel said. I want change. Every person in the lounge leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the moment's gravity. This was the pivot point, the instant where power revealed its true nature. Would Daniel use his newfound leverage to punish? To demand terminations and public apologies? To extract revenge for the humiliation he'd endured? Margaret stood rigid, waiting for judgment. Her earlier certainty had crumbled completely, leaving behind only the fear of someone who'd made a catastrophic error and knew the consequences were coming. Blake and Ethan looked equally tense, probably calculating whether their pensions were about to evaporate. The businessman had his phone out again, recording now without pretense. This was the moment people would share, would discuss, would use as evidence for whatever argument they wanted to make about class or justice or human nature. The elderly couple held hands, the woman's knuckles white. The woman in designer sunglasses had gone very still. Daniel took a breath, and in that pause, the storm outside seemed to intensify, wind rattling the windows. I don't want anyone fired, he said. Margaret's eyes widened. Blake's shoulders dropped with relief so profound it was visible from across the room. But I do want this incident documented and investigated, Daniel continued. Not to punish, but to understand. How many other people have been judged this way? How many passengers have been turned away or treated poorly because they didn't look like someone's idea of premium? How many times has this happened when the person didn't have a private jet waiting to prove their worth? Harold nodded slowly. We'll conduct a full review. I want more than a review, Daniel said. I want training. Real training. Not a checkbox exercise. Training about implicit bias. About the assumptions we make. About how to treat people with dignity regardless of what they're wearing. He looked directly at Margaret. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has blind spots. The question is whether we learn from them. Margaret's face was red now, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I also want this lounge and every premium facility at this airport to partner with local organizations that serve working families, veterans, people who don't usually get access to these spaces. Provide lounge passes for parents traveling alone with children, for medical travel, for emergencies. Make this space about more than just money. The businessman lowered his phone slowly, his expression thoughtful. That's— Harold paused, clearly recalculating everything he'd thought he knew about this situation. That's generous, Mr. Hayes. Very generous. It's not generous, Daniel said. It's just right. My mother built her wealth by investing in communities. She'd want that wealth used to make those communities better, not to build higher walls between people. He glanced at the window again, at the Gulf Stream, waiting in the snow. I need to board. The lawyers in Denver are expecting me. Lily's expecting me to come home. He picked up his small duffel bag, the one that had probably contributed to Margaret's assumption that he didn't belong. As he moved toward the exit that would lead to the private gates, Harold walked with him. Mr. Hayes? I'll personally oversee the implementation of everything you've suggested. You have my word. Daniel nodded. Your word is enough. But follow-through matters more than promises. At the door to the jetway, Daniel paused and turned back to the lounge one final time. Margaret stood behind her desk, tears streaming now. Blake and Ethan had moved to the window, watching. The passengers had begun to whisper among themselves. "Respect doesn't come after the private jet lands," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly. "It should be there from the beginning. For everyone." Then he walked toward his aircraft, leaving the winter lounge to process what had just happened. The jetway to the private gate was empty and quiet, insulated from the storm but carrying its presence in the way the structure swayed subtly with each gust of wind. Daniel's boots echoed on the metal flooring as he walked toward the open door of the Gulf Stream, where warm light spilled out into the gray afternoon. Captain Rebecca Morrison stood at the top of the stairs, her uniform crisp despite the weather, her expression professional but warm. She was a former Air Force pilot, one of Northern Crest's most experienced captains, and someone Daniel had flown with twice before. She knew his story. She knew he wasn't like most charter clients. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him. "Ready to get you to Denver. Weather's rough, but we have a good window." "Thanks, Rebecca." Daniel climbed the stairs, the metal cold even through his gloves. At the top, he paused to look back at the terminal. Through the windows of the winter lounge, he could see figures moving, could imagine the conversations happening, the recalibrations, the post-mortems of what had just transpired. Inside the Gulfstream's cabin, warmth enveloped him immediately. The interior was cream leather and polished wood, designed for executives who needed to work while traveling. But Daniel had never quite adjusted to the luxury. He still felt more comfortable in his workshop, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of fresh-cut lumber. He settled into a seat by the window as the co-pilot, Thomas Chen, appeared from the cockpit. "We'll have you airborne in 5 minutes, Mr. Hayes. Flight time about 40 minutes if the winds stay favorable." "Thank you, Thomas." The door sealed with a hydraulic hiss. The engines spooled up from idle to taxi power, their sound changing from background hum to purposeful thrust. Through the window, Daniel watched the ground crew disconnect their equipment and pull away, their orange vests bright against the white landscape. The Gulfstream began to move, rolling away from the gate with the smooth acceleration of precision engineering. The terminal slid past the winter lounge, visible for just a moment, faces still pressed to the glass, and then they were taxiing toward the runway, following the yellow lights that marked the path through the storm. Daniel pulled out his phone and saw 3 missed calls from his sister, 2 texts asking if he was okay, if the flight was still happening. He texted back, "Boarding now. Home by 9. Then he saw another notification, a voicemail from Lily, left an hour ago. He pressed play, and his daughter's voice filled his ear, bright and warm even through the phone's tiny speaker. "Hi, Daddy. Aunt Sarah says there's a big storm, but I know your plane can fly through anything because it's really strong. I finished my homework and I'm helping make dinner. I made the salad all by myself, even the dressing. We're making your favorite, that chicken thing with the lemon. Oh, and I drew you another picture. This one is us in Denver, signing the important papers. I drew you wearing a tie because Aunt Sarah said lawyers like ties. I can't wait to see what you bring back. Something real, remember? I love you. Fly safe." Daniel closed his eyes, the phone still pressed to his ear even though the message had ended. His throat felt tight. Lily had drawn him wearing a tie, because that's what she thought lawyers required, what she thought Daniel needed to be taken seriously. But he'd gone to the airport in work clothes, and it had been enough. More than enough. Not because of the private jet that was just circumstantial proof of worth that shouldn't have been necessary, but because dignity and respect should never require proof. They should be the starting point, not the reward for meeting someone's visual expectations. The Gulfstream turned onto the runway. Through the window, Daniel could see the lights stretching ahead into the storm, marking a path through the white chaos. Rebecca's voice came over the intercom. "Cleared for takeoff." The engines roared. The aircraft surged forward, pressing Daniel back into his seat with the force of acceleration. The runway lights blurred past, faster and faster, the storm swirling around them in a tunnel of white. And then, with the gentle lift that came from expert piloting and 40,000 pounds of thrust, the Gulfstream left the ground. The storm was still there, the snow still falling, the wind still pushing, but they were above it now, climbing through it, rising toward clear air and destination. Below, Aspen Ridge International Airport fell away into the winter landscape. The winter lounge, with its gas fireplace and its champagne and its harsh lessons about judgment and dignity, became small and distant. Somewhere in that airport, Harold Whitmore was probably already in meetings about policy changes. Margaret was probably facing consequences, learning lessons she should have learned long ago. Blake and Ethan were probably writing reports that would become case studies in training materials. And somewhere in the lounge, passengers were going home with a story about the man in work boots who owned the private jet. Some would tell it as a cautionary tale about assumptions. Some would reduce it to social media content. Some would forget it by tomorrow. But Daniel hoped, desperately hoped, that at least one person, maybe the elderly woman or the young athlete or even the businessman in cashmere, would remember what mattered most. Respect doesn't arrive after proof of worth. It should be present from the beginning, extended freely to every person regardless of their clothes or their status or their appearance. It should be as fundamental as warmth in winter, as necessary as air, as unconditional as the love between a father and daughter who drew pictures of sunshine with every color she owned. The Gulfstream broke through the top of the storm clouds at 18,000 feet. Suddenly, the turbulence ceased. The gray chaos gave way to clear sky, brilliant blue, with the last light of sunset painting the cloud tops gold and pink and orange. Daniel looked out at the beauty of it, the storm below, the peace above, the transition between them so sharp you could point to the exact moment everything changed. He thought about Lily, waiting at home with her salad and her drawing and her request for something real. He thought about his mother, who'd taught him that wealth was responsibility and character mattered more than appearance. He thought about the winter lounge and Margaret's judgment and the silence of witnesses who could have spoken but didn't, and he knew exactly what he'd tell Lily when he got home. Not about the private jet or the vindication or the moment when everyone realized their mistake. Those were just surface details, the dramatic elements that would make a good story but didn't carry the real weight. He'd tell her about dignity, about treating people with respect, not because they've proven they deserve it, but because that's how human beings should treat each other, always, from the very first moment. He'd tell her about the kind of person she should strive to be. Not someone who judges by appearance, but someone who sees beneath the surface. Someone who speaks up when others stay silent. Someone who uses whatever privilege or power or resources she has to make the world more just, not to build walls between herself and others. He'd tell her that the most valuable thing he brought back from Denver wasn't the signed trust documents or the secured future or even the lesson learned by airport staff. It was the reminder that how we treat people when they can't prove their worth, that's what defines us. That's what matters. That's what's real. The Gulfstream flew on through the clear air, carrying Daniel toward Denver, toward lawyers and signatures, and the financial security his mother had wanted for her granddaughter. Below, the storm continued to rage, but up here, in the calm above the chaos, everything was crystalline and certain. Daniel pulled out Lily's drawing from his pocket, the stick figures holding hands under the exploding sun. He smoothed it carefully, the paper soft from being folded and carried, and he smiled. She'd used every color for that sun, every single one, as if warmth was something that required all the shades in the world to properly represent, as if kindness and respect and basic human dignity were like that too. Not simple things, but complex, requiring every part of ourselves to extend genuinely. Outside the window, the sunset continued painting the clouds in impossible colors, and Daniel Hayes' timber framer, single father, reluctant inheritor of wealth he was still learning to steward, flew toward home with the most important lesson intact. The measure of a person has nothing to do with what they wear or own or fly in. It's in how they treat others when no one's watching, when there's no reward for kindness, when doing the right thing costs them something. That was real. That was what mattered. That was what he'd tell his daughter, and maybe, just maybe,